Welcome to the top-rated and award-nominated Grad School Femtoring podcast, the place for first-gen BIPOCs to learn about all things grad school, personal development, and sustainable productivity. This is Doctora Yvette Martinez-Vu, and I will be serving as your Femtor, providing you with tips and tricks and everything else you need to know to successfully navigate grad school and beyond. For over 13 years, I've been empowering first-gen students of color along their academic and professional journeys, and I'm really excited to support you too. Doctora Yvette here. Before starting today's episode, I want to announce that my co-authored book, Is Grad School for Me? Demystifying the Application Process for First-Gen BIPOC Students, is available for pre-order. It officially comes out on April 16th, and between now and the rest of the year, my co-author and I are available to speak at your next event. We are excited because this is the first book that provides first-generation, low-income, and non-traditional students of color with insider knowledge on how to consider and navigate grad school. It's the book that we both wish we had when we were undertaking our own grad admissions process at UCLA many years ago. The book is both a corrective and a calling card to the lack of clear guidance for historically excluded students navigating the onerous and often overwhelming process of applying to grad school. We walk you through the process from first asking yourself whether grad school is even the right next step for you, to then providing you with step-by-step instructions on how to maneuver every aspect of the grad admissions process, including providing you with sample essays, templates, and relatable scenarios. If you're interested, we encourage you to pre-order your copy today or have your local library order a copy. You can also reach out to us for bulk order discount codes. Lastly, we are available for book talks, workshops, keynotes, panels, and even book club visitations. Go to www.gradschoolfemtoring.com/book to learn more. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Grad School Femtoring podcast. This is your host, Doctora Yvette. Today, we're going to discuss the topic of pivoting from pre-med to a PhD program. I actually think this is a really timely episode because I've had several people reach out to me and have recently started working with med school applicants. And I just think that this is a topic that I haven't really covered. So I'm glad that I get to talk to someone who has actually lived the process of pivoting. Our guest today is Julio Salas, and he is a Chancellor's Fellow and a first-year Sociology PhD student at UC Berkeley. Centering immigrant families, his research interests lie at the nexus of immigration, race and ethnicity, social stratification, and health. He's a second-gen Colombian and Mexican immigrant born and raised in Corona, Queens, New York, who could have never imagined entering the spaces and accomplishing the feats that he has accomplished. Because of his profoundly non-traditional path and the unlikelihood of being where he is, Julio attempts to do all that he can to make his spaces and the world a better place for other marginalized folks. Ooh, I can relate to that. Welcome to the podcast, Julio.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Of course. So I would love for you to get us started by sharing a little bit more. I know I shared in the intro kind of that you're currently a student, but I would love to hear more about your background and backstory and how you arrived at the point you're at now in your academics and career.
Yeah, which is going to be definitely a long answer, so I'm going to prepare you for that.
I know.
Yeah.
The 5-minute version.
Yeah. And before I begin, just want to say thank you for having me. Really excited and looking forward to the conversation, and want to commend you for what you do and for this podcast, which is so important and needed. So want to first say that. And then, as I said, I'll try to make it seem like a linear path, though it definitely wasn't that. And I think I'll start sort of where the intro ended, which is the place, Corona, Queens, New York, and also this unlikelihood. So was born and raised in Corona, Queens, New York, which is a predominantly Latinx immigrant neighborhood. I was the oldest of 4, raised by a single mother and grandmother. And I usually say like up until 2016, when I was 18 years old, when I started community college, I was just kind of wandering through life. And what I mean by that often is that I had no clue what I wanted to do. Um, there was no ambition for reasons that, yeah, I was stuck or I fell, or when I'm thinking about it now in hindsight, it was a place where I didn't see much mobility. No one sort of left. It's very sort of segregated place. Uh, and so I had no clue what the world looked like outside of that zip code really and other neighboring places. And it wasn't until I applied to colleges in high school because it was sort of the next thing. I just thought, this is what I'm supposed to do. What was funny was that I applied to local colleges, um, a few very close to my house. And I was under the assumption that no one gets denied to these colleges. These are just like, everyone just gets in because it was just like the local colleges. I had no idea of like selectiveness. I didn't apply to other like, schools like Berkeley, for example. And I got denied from these colleges that I thought everyone gets in. I was under the assumption it
Mm.
doesn't matter how you're performing. And I didn't have bad grades. I didn't, while I mentioned that I didn't really have ambition, I also didn't have what people would consider maybe bad grades. I just did what I had to do, sort of. And that upsetted me a lot, actually, which was good. Cause so I only got accepted to community college, which ended up going to Queensborough Community College. And I remember I felt two things. One, I felt really dumb. And I was just like, whoa, like,
Mm.
cause I was under this impression, no one gets denied. And then the second part was I had acknowledged I was the oldest of four. There was this idea that no one was going to come and save us from the conditions of whether it was being low income, whether it was my family being undocumented, so living in a mixed status family where I'm a citizen and they're not,
Mm.
and the challenges that come with it. Um, and so it just was like, Julio, you either got to do something, or because no one sort of, you know. And so I remember just committing myself, like to do something. I had no clue. I was just like, I always say the funny sort of things that I was doing my first semester at community college because I had no clue. I was Googling. I mean, at the time, Google was well, that was my best friend. That was like everything. And so I would
Mhm.
Google how to be smart, how to study, how to be better. And I would do this thing where I
Mm.
was also getting ready, listening to motivational sort of like podcasts, I guess, or YouTube videos, because I was just like, I just need to do something. So it was kind of like working very hard, but there was no going money. Um,
Mm.
Thankfully, then I fell into mentors, which was like the first time sort of I felt that there was people that wanted to help me, and then two people I also wanted to be like. I kind of grew up in a
Mm.
space where I usually say I didn't have too many positive role models, um, and all those things begin to it kind of like a snowball, and like a very helpful pipeline program called America Needs You, which helps first gen low income students, was very helpful in finally showing me like other first gen low income students that were like transferring to universities that were also going to these big name universities. And that was the first time I thought, okay, I'm going to apply to Cornell. And there's a funny story there where I only applied there because I didn't meet a previous deadline. And I was like, okay. Um, so then I miraculously get into Cornell, which is it's a different world. It's only about four and a half, 5 hours from New York City, but it couldn't be more different. Again, I grew up in a place where it was weird, for example, to see white people. And now I'm in a place where it's the complete opposite. I'm
Mhm.
the weird one. um, and then just through there, a lot of challenges and getting sort of this first time of being in a predominantly white space. I had never been in one. There was definitely distance and I knew like white people were different, but they weren't in the part where I grew up. I mean, it was predominantly, like I said, Latinx
Mhm.
immigrant and nearby black folks. It wasn't, so that
Yeah.
was the first time and then went through a lot of challenges there. But I think the way I talk about at least Cornell, which was a difficult time, but also very special time was that it was so difficult that it made things easier. So it was kind of like rough, very rough training. Um, and then, yeah, sort of found myself now here at Berkeley, which we can talk more about.
Mhm. I I was wondering if you could say more about that, what you just said about it was difficult at Cornell, but it made things easier. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think it's probably a cynical way of also looking at it. I will admit that. Um,
Okay.
so it was difficult for many different reasons. I think socially, again, it was the first time I was in a place where, I think if I'm not mistaken, it's about 10 to 20% of Cornell's undergrad is from the 1%. That's a very different, they're coming from very
Yeah.
different upbringings. They're at the best high schools, um, obviously. And that then, so I felt one very socially isolated and very different.
Mhm.
Um, there was definitely a rigor to the classes that I was not used to. And also when I was pre-med at the time, the way that the classes are graded is what's on a curve. And I remember
Oh.
even even when I was in undergrad, I was like, what is the curve? Like I never understood that concept. And I never understood what that really meant until actually I graduated. And if people are now
Mhm.
aware of what it means and why I'm bringing this up is because the way I see it, it's a blatantly unjust grading system where
Mhm.
the average is set by the people. But if the people are already so advanced, it's it's not to say that others that are not at that level can't be there, but it just puts it at such disadvantage. And the analogy that I like to think about a lot is, let's say you get the nine best soccer players in the world, any nine best soccer players in the world, and you get maybe the best soccer player kid in New York City. And you tell him play with the other best soccer players in the world. He might, one game or two, he might make a goal. He might actually do good things because he's pretty good. But if you look at it on average, it's just a different level that they're playing at,
Yeah.
right? So right there, it's pretty unfair for people that fall in the margins and are not in that average thing.
Yeah.
Uh, and so definitely, and it makes you think something's wrong with you. And it reinforces a very individualistic blaming of like, oh, well, all you have to do is work hard. And it's not, they don't think really like in the context of it. Um, so that was really difficult where I was just like getting pushed to levels I didn't think was possible, right? Like academically reading, being a full-time student, um, like the amount of like, it was really like 9 to 5, just studying and in between class. It was very consuming. And I think why I say it made things easier was because on the flip end, it trained me so much. I guess you could say, or it was such high intensity that then when I began to work at the Urban Institute, which is a research organization, I was sort of used to this pace. And also, you know,
Mm.
it benefited me to be in that to gain sort of like the social and cultural capital of those spaces where, we're reading so much. So I'm like, my knowledge base is growing, for example, in ways that maybe other other programs or other universities are not. And I don't say that in a way of like, oh, Cornell's better in this. I just mean it in terms of the intensity. A lot of times I remember just being puzzled by how hard it was. Like it felt like undergrad courses were like probably graduate courses at other universities. And
Mhm.
then Cornell at least had the reputation of being a grade deflation school, where instead of being likely to give more A's, especially in the pre-med space, they would they would lean more on the end of giving lower grades. So all in all, I think, and then the final point, which I think it made it easier was for me, I've never been in such a more white and privileged space that even though I still remain in them, Urban Institute is one, Berkeley is one, it wasn't as worse. So in some ways, a lot of
Mm.
the challenges that are still there, like the outsiderness or the isolation, it's like because it was so bad, now that it's here, sort of on a lower level of bad, it doesn't feel as intense. But that obviously ignores the damage and wear and tear that still has sort of on people that
Mhm.
are quote unquote outsiders.
Thank you for bringing it up, and I'm actually curious, if you were pre-med, Like, at what point did you decide to be pre-med? Was it before realizing how hard the classes were? Was it in the middle of
Mhm,
learning about the curve and how difficult
mhm.
these, what we used to call weeder classes, or just
Yeah,
like
yeah,
the classes that are intentionally set to be hard so that some folks get pushed out? Which you straight up said it. They are unjust. They're
mhm.
unfair. It really does. It does. Um, Substantially negatively impact folks
Yeah,
on the margins. But yeah, I'm curious kind of at what point did
yeah.
you decide to go pre-med, and then at
Mhm.
what point did you realize that wasn't it and start to transition to something else?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So when I went to QCC, Queensborough Community College, again, just undeclared, I had probably because I knew so little, and I think, and this is sort of like a stereotype slash generalization that like, first gen students know of less career paths or aren't told outside of
Mhm.
probably like STEM, sort of like doctor, lawyer, engineer. But I was kind of intimidated of pursuing med school right there. So at the moment I did physician assistant, which is, now and at the time they're almost already at the role, basically at the role of a physician. But it was just less schooling. I saw it as like less schooling, a little maybe quote unquote more feasible. Um, and
I'm
then
so
when
sorry.
yeah,
Can you say that part one more time? Because I didn't catch
mhm,
that. Just, what you said right now about,
yeah.
being deciding to go, the PA route, and then
Mhm,
what did
mhm.
you say after that?
That it seemed easier and sort of more feasible, and I think less intimidating than med school since it was like 6
Mm.
years and there's other requirements. But it's still a very intense sort of, career path and a very rewarding one. But it wasn't up until I got to Cornell actually that I decided, oh, or like the last semester at QCC where I became, pre-med. And I think one of the main things that I remember was, as this is all unfolding, as the semesters are going on, I'm beginning to build more, I guess, confidence because I'm
Mhm.
beginning to get things and understand all these like what people would call the hidden curriculum. So part of it was one part that I switched to pre-med was that I actually felt, wow, like I'm beginning to develop this quote unquote potential, or like now it's becoming clear that I could do something. It felt like why not go all the way of being a physician? So that was certainly one where I was like, oh, before
Mhm.
I was choosing PA because it felt at the moment like it was a bit easier, but then I would be, I guess, selling myself short. So that was the main sort of reason for it. And then, I mean, the other one was like, which I say, and I mean, most people ideally would go into be a physician for this, and it's a little cliche or corny. Is that the main thing was to help people. And I think specifically what had also happened at community college was that I for the first time, came across the social sciences, and mainly at the time,
Mm.
psychology. And that for me, I mean, I became in love, in love.
Mhm.
Um, but it was mainly because for the first time in my life, it allowed me to make sense of my upbringing, and it allowed me to make sense of Corona Queens as a place and how a childhood trauma affects us as adults, different team
Mm.
parenting styles and their effects on children. And so I was like, oh, this was like my mom's parenting style and, all these things. And the other one was like sort of how our social world shapes our health if we say live in a polluted place, but so I became so intrigued by that. And that was a big thing where then I was like, okay, I'm interested now in becoming sort of a physician. And because I had this really like, I guess really like an admiration with childhood, especially, I wanted to be a pediatrician to like work with children and
Mm.
parents. Um, and so I just, and also because I thought that we needed better. And by we, I meant like other first gen students, other Latinx families, other marginalized folks, where when I was sort of growing up, I never felt like clinics or people working in the clinics really went out of their way to understand what's going on at home. And also the medical system for the most part doesn't reward that. So I also understand that aspect of it. So in many ways, I thought we deserve more and I thought I could be the better just by being sort of more consciously aware and also having some experiences. Um, but I think it ultimately came down to wanting to sort of take it to the full step of like not selling myself short, sort of being this obsession of the social scientist and social science and what we now call the social determinants of health. Um, And then I thought sort of this as it relates to my upbringing, like, oh, I think it would be good to be a pediatrician and really try to be there for sort of like low income families and immigrant families.
What happened then if you were interested in the social determinants of health
Mhm,
and you were still on the pre-med track, but you realized there was an interest in psychology? Somehow, sociology, something happened
mhm.
with Soch.
Yeah,
So what happened?
yeah. So it's May 2022. This is, I mean, now it's like a year and a half, but it's May 2022. I'm living in Washington D.C. I'm finishing up a public policy fellowship, uh, where, like I was at the House of Reps, and then I'm at the Urban Institute, which I mentioned earlier, which is a policy research organization
Mm.
for the second half of
Well,
my placement.
whoa. You jumped to public policy. I'm still in my head, you're in the pre-med route. So at some point you were like, "I'm not gonna do pre-med, I'm gonna maybe do public policy." ¿O qué pasó? Like, I'm trying to,
That's
like,
enough.
connect the
No, yeah,
dots.
yeah. No, that's really good because, yeah, and I think this is something I probably don't talk about as much. So it's good also to talk about it and think about it. So, of course, the pandemic's happening. I graduated May 2021. So pandemic's still, going on,
Mm.
right? Pandemic begins March 2020. I go back home to New York City. I left. I could have stayed up at Cornell. I go back because my mom becomes sick with the virus. So I'm
Mm.
staying in New York City. And I applied to this other fellowship actually, and it's a community health fellowship in Pomona, California. And I get it. That would have been very
Oh.
perfect for the pre-med context. It was everything. It was really cool. It's a really cool opportunity. I ended up getting it. My mom is still sick at the time, and so I decided it doesn't feel
Mm.
right to leave across the country. Um, and then I decline it. And so I'm like, okay, then what am I going to do? I'm about to graduate. I don't really, I know I need to be in New York City. And I knew someone that applied for this fellowship, which is the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute Public Policy Fellowship, very long name, CHCI for short.
Mhm.
And they brought it up sort of. Deadline was in a few days, I think, or something. I don't remember actually like the sort of time span I had. Applied on a whim, thankfully also got it.
Ah.
And so it's like, okay, DC feels a little, at that time, the pandemic's getting better. And you can say that's relative, but it's getting better in the sense that things are becoming in person. The program was in person because the year before me it wasn't. So I go to DC because again, it was like there had the way I framed it was I've been interested in health on a micro level. Let's see how it works at a macro level in policy. And
Mm.
so it was sort of this opportunity to expand my horizon. It worked out sort of where DC was close to New York City, where I could go home once a month. Um, and also, I mean, also, when I started, I should say, actually, 'cause I started the program August 2021. My mom passed away May 2021 related to the virus. So at that
I'm
point, it
so
wasn't,
sorry.
thank you so much. At that point, it was also, now that I think about it, it was a new opportunity. Um,
Mm.
I didn't have to worry so much. I think I had to worry in different ways,
Mhm.
siblings or my own grief, my siblings' grief, my family's grief. But it was sort of her being sick wasn't like a deterrent anymore, unfortunately, because she had passed away.
Mm.
So and then the way the fellowship is structured is you could do 9 months on Capitol Hill, which is just the Senate or the House of Reps, or you could split it. I had a feeling I wouldn't be so interested in like the political world, and I was definitely right. It's an interesting place. It's for some people. It definitely wasn't for me, which I think it's a good thing to experience different things because I think just as important as it is to know what you do like and what you want to do, it's so good to also know what you don't like and what you don't want to do.
Mhm.
Um, so then the first placement at the House of Reps runs from September 2021 to December 20. Had a great time. I can acknowledge it wasn't for me and I overall had a great time. And then the next one, it just works out where I land at the Urban Institute, which is a research policy organization. I had also done undergrad research throughout for the most part, especially at Cornell, um, somewhat related to health, but also not. I think I approached the research as like a way of just doing what felt right in the moment and with good
Mhm.
people. and I like got really good mentors. And so what's occurring, so also as all of this is going on, this fellowship is going on, I'm preparing to apply to med, you know,
Oh.
especially January 2022, which is when I begin at the Urban Institute. I'm beginning to study for the MCAT, you know, because the application usually opens around June. I think it's more or less around there is when you can begin to apply. So I'm studying for the MCAT in January, you know, beginning to write all my essays. I'm asking for rec letters. Like the plan is fully to still go to med. But there's a couple of things that are happening at the same time, especially once it hits May. Because May, you know, I'm like, at that point in May, I'm like 2 weeks away from the MCAT. You know, I had already gotten the rec letters. My essays have gotten
Crunch
feedback.
time.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
And a couple of things happened. One, I loved what I was doing at the Urban Institute. I mean, I became also again in love with research because in the past, and some people still feel this way, and I don't necessarily disagree. You know, some people think, who's going to read this research? Like it just stays within the academy, within academia. You know, it doesn't really get disseminated into public. Um, but what we were doing, I mean, I was just doing really interesting work. I had a really great team, and I realized how much I love to read, write, and to think, which is in hindsight what a PhD is. Like that's how I say
Mhm.
sort of think about it. I love to do that in my personal time as I'm being like I try to reflect on a lot of things, think about especially this whole idea of like thinking a lot about my upbringing and how it relates to present. So on one end, I'm becoming in love with research and I'm like, I could really see myself doing this. On the second end, when I got feedback from people, mainly a good friend of mine and a mentor on my application, on my personal statement, they tell me, you know, it's really good, it's really well written, but it's not clear why med school. They're like, you can
Mm.
put this into law school, you could put this into a PhD program, and it would make sense. So it's not, they're basically telling me you need to be more clear why medicine. And then I was like, okay, two people said that.
Ooh,
But
I've said that to folks too.
yeah,
Where I'm reviewing an application and they're telling me they're applying to pharmacy school, and I'm like, "This sounds like you're applying to med school, not pharmacy s
mm,
Why pharmacy?"
mhm.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut
No,
you
no,
off,
no.
but, that's good that they asked you those questions.
No, it's good because, you know, a funny story, it was the first time it was my good friend. I mean, my really good friend, Brandon. And I remember to myself, I was like, oh, I kind of felt like, it definitely affected my ego. And I was like, oh, I kind of like thought, you know, maybe he doesn't know what he's saying or not. He was spot on. He was very good. And I'm happy that he was very honest with me, which is, you need those people. You need those people to tell you those things. And then the second one was when a mentor did it for me. And I was like, oh, wow, like I have to really do listen. And then as I'm writing the other parts of the application, which another part of the med school application is like, you have to write about your experiences and how maybe they helped shape why you're going to med school. So like if you did research, writing about your research. And when I was writing that, it was very forced. It felt very much like I'm tailoring this too much to what they want to hear, what I should say instead of why I want to, or like what I should say for myself and for my own passion. And then one of the final things is the second mentor who reviewed my thing. He went to med school. We had a very similar upbringing. It's a very also another. I have a lot of so many funny stories. He had a very similar upbringing where he like was like raised a block away from where I was raised. Also went to Cornell. Also first gen.
Wow.
Went to med school, but he doesn't become a physician. And so I thought to myself, I need to have a conversation and try to understand why he didn't, how he was feeling it. And the number one question I asked him, which right there was like, okay, this is all making sense that this is not for me. And I asked him, you know, you decided in residency to not become a physician, but did you have any inklings of that feeling earlier? And he told me he did. And he told me that he had it as early as being an undergrad. And, but his sort of thing was, he's like, you know, this may sound sort of like weird to say. He's like, but med school's so structured and that felt safer. I knew what I was going to be doing. 4 years of med school, three plus years residency, then you become a physician. He was like, for example, he's like, you in the PhD, it's very ambiguous. It's up to you. There's like different milestones. And right there, I thought, yeah, this isn't, I don't want to go like through the process of med school and then potentially be later on. Because I could have I projected what that life would look like and I could see myself leaving. And I think that if I did that, I
Mm.
would be really, I think, bothered or maybe a little regretful. And so sort of all those things came together. And I was just like, yeah, this isn't what I think I should be doing. And I remember I went to a coffee shop in DC and I remember I left and I told myself, we're deciding right now. I'm not leaving the coffee shop until I make a decision. Do I continue or do I not? Um, I spent maybe like an hour, 2 hours just journaling, really trying to think. And funny enough, I mean, the main thing I was worried about, especially towards the end, is like, yeah, I have to tell people, this is like
Mm.
a year, like this is years in the making, right? And, I'm this first gen kid who like quote unquote is beginning to make it because I transferred to a place like Cornell and all these things. And the main person I kind of was afraid to tell was my grandma. And I was like,
Oh.
for her, I thought my friends would also understand. And if people didn't understand, maybe, I shouldn't really like listen to them. But I leave the coffee shop deciding, yeah, I'm not going to go to med school. I'm going to not. So I dropped the application. And thankfully I had the conversation, I think that same day with my grandma, and it was a really good response. She said something along the lines of, you you basically have a track record of making good decisions. So if this is
Mm.
if this makes you happy and if you feel this is right, I trust it. I trust you. And that was, all I needed to hear. And then all my friends also were supportive. But yeah, it came down to sort of loving research, thinking, sort of realizing that I wasn't super interested in medicine. And I never was, I
Mm.
should say this as well. I was never drawn to the physical side of medicine. Like I had met a lot of people that were pre-med and they were so fascinated, just the way I was fascinated by the social sciences. They're fascinated by the body, the way the kidneys work. And that was never interesting to me. I was always interested in, how does immigration status affect health? How does living in
Mhm.
poverty affect health? Um, and so, yeah, then I decided, which we can also talk about sort of, okay, now I'm going to pivot, but what exactly is the pivot? It wasn't clear when I basically decided that the pre-med thing wasn't what I was going to do, but I also wasn't super clear. Oh, PhD in sociology, which is, yeah. So that's sort of how I came to it.
I'm glad that you mentioned like what it narrowed down to because when you said, "Oh, I was interested in research," I was thinking, "But you can go to a medical school that has that research
Hmm.
option. So
Hmm.
why not that?" But then when you said, "Oh, I wasn't as interested in medicine like as a field and the topics related to it, the way that you were related to these other topics in the social sciences, that makes
Hmm.
a lot of sense." Is there anything that you feel like that it's important to share about the differences between medical school and graduate school that might be helpful for our listeners who may
Yeah.
be new to these fields? And some people
Hmm.
conflate the two. Some people
Hmm.
think that when you're talking about grad school, you're talking about med school. And
Yeah.
usually, when I talk about it, I know everybody says it differently. When I'm talking about grad school, I'm talking about master's and PhD programs. And
Hmm.
when I'm talking about, professional programs, I'm specifically thinking med school, law school,
Yeah.
business school. But
Hmm.
everybody says it differently. But just generally
Yeah.
speaking, assuming that grad school is MA, PhD, and as that being different from med school, is there anything that
Hmm.
would be helpful for listeners to know about the differences?
Yeah, no, for sure. That's a really good point. I think so. Yeah, when I was thinking grad school, I'll mean it in the context, like you said, of masters and PhD, and I'll definitely focus a bit more on the PhD, though I'm also aware of some of the master's differences and of med school. So for the most part in the US, and I also focus on the US, I should say that. US med school typically is 4 years 4 years of med school and on average 3+ years of residency, which depends on your specialty. I would say one of the and then Masters, there's 1 year masters, there's like 2 year masters, and then PhD, which is also different by discipline, can go from, I think, usually shorter end is like 4 years to 7 years. But one of the key differences is the structure of it. So med school is very structured. It's do this, do this, do this. And for the most part, unless maybe different reasons you struggle or fail something, it could take maybe a little longer. But for the most part, I think there's very much rigidity in that you're going to make those milestones, 4 years, right? And then resident. PhD, I mean, some people are 8th year PhDs, 9th year PhDs, 10th year for different
Hmm.
reasons. So the structure, there are milestones. So, and then I'll speak a little about, I guess, in sociology. So my program is 6 years. That if you do everything on time, it should take you 6 years. But there's a lot of ambiguity. And what I mean by that is could take a long time. You know, there's some
Hmm.
studies that, it could take a year, 2 years, 3 years. Um,
Yeah.
so because the focus, at least of a PhD program, is research, there's so many variables at play. For example, the pandemic was one where a lot of research had to stop. So you were kind of stuck in a PhD program, and it probably extended your time a year or 2 years, depending unless you
Hmm.
maneuvered something where maybe you were able to get like quantitative survey data and build the research. So I would say the structure is one where med school is very structured and PhD is less structured. Masters are also more structured, where for the most part, they also, if it's a year, they want to get you out in a year, 2 years. Another big difference is the funding. So typically, as well, PhD programs in the US, and I'll also say especially if so I should also say this, ranking matters a lot in academia. Unfortunately, it's a very elitist place. So in PhDs, obviously, if programs are ranked better, they have more money. But I bring this up because PhDs typically are what people will say fully funded. But that is also a term that is very ambiguous and differs by
Hmm.
school, differs by private school, public school resources. But basically, what it means for PhDs is at least they'll find a way to pay your tuition and then give you a stipend to live off of. And that stipend could be usually tied to teaching. So you're a teaching assistant. Whereas med school, you can definitely get full rides as well, but that isn't, I would say, the norm or the common thing. Hence, a lot of debt
I
that is
agree.
accumulated with med school. There are for sure people that get full scholarships, but maybe they still have to take out loans to live. Or they get somehow, I think maybe there might be now, or even earlier, like where they also give some sort of stipend situation. But it's different in that sense, where for the most part, PhDs are known to be what would be fully funded. Master's
Hmm.
program, the funding is even less. And for the most part, you have to pay for it, take out loans. Very few, I think, offer like full tuition scholarships. But then again,
Yeah.
even if you get a full tuition scholarship, you still might have to take out a loan to sort of live.
Hmm.
And then I think one of the final things that's different, and this is more PhD versus MD, is that back to the structure thing of MD, it's sort of like undergrad, I think, where you're being told that you're given all this information and you're supposed to like memorize it and know it really well, and then apply it to patients or different sort of settings. But the PhD, while you're learning so much, the focus, especially like in academia, is like you're producing knowledge. You're
Hmm.
sort of creating new ideas. If you want to challenge ideas, you can. So it's very much, it isn't, yeah, it isn't like the whole point isn't to necessarily memorize everything and regurgitate things. It's definitely to make a contribution. That is really like the goal of a PhD, to create something that hasn't been done. So I would say those are like sort of the three different things, like the structure, the funding, and the difference between more like memorization versus like producing, creating knowledge.
Great. So I have like 2 to 3 more questions for
Hmm.
you today. The next question actually is a little bit different, but it's tied to what you mentioned earlier about in your bio, you said you're non traditional, and then you talked about your trajectory and how when you were at Cornell, you felt very much like an outsider. But not but, and yet you still worked up the courage and the confidence to reach out to me to be on the
Mhm.
podcast. And you have worked up the courage and confidence to accomplish a lot of other things. Even to pivot is a big deal because some
Mm,
people
mhm.
refuse to pivot because of the fear and the shame of telling others. Like that fear
Yeah.
and shame of telling your abuelita could have held you back from making
Mhm.
that pivot so
Mhm.
soon. So the question then is, a lot of my listeners, and I'm not gonna lie, sometimes I get stuck on this too, even
Mhm.
though I know better, will struggle with what some people call imposter syndrome
Mm,
or imposter
yeah.
phenomenon. So I'm wondering, how have you or how are you currently navigating that?
Mm,
How do you manage this, especially given your non-traditional
mhm.
background, especially as a Latino in a predominantly white space at a top-ranked university?
Mhm.
What's given you the confidence to keep
Mhm.
going, to keep meeting these milestones, and to
Yeah.
believe that you actually belong in these spaces?
Mm. Amazing question. It is a very common thing, and it's changed so much over time. Um, so there's a couple, I think, answers to that question. And I think the first one is I don't think it's such a positive way to look at it, but and it might not be the most helpful, but it's sort of like the sad reality for me, at least, that helps me. And I think and I try to talk when I meet with other students that are in a similar boat. This is one part of it, is this idea that I am an outsider. I don't belong. You'll hear that you'll probably hear a lot of people say like these spaces weren't made for. And
Mhm.
there's this really good book by sociologist Victoria Reyes called Academic Outsider, which is right here, stories of exclusion and hope. And she says a lot of great things. It's a really great book. But one of the things I took from it was that if you don't fit the mold of being sort of like middle upper class, well educated, white, um, you'll always be an outsider. You'll never fit in. And so the way I think about that is knowing that I'm like, okay, the point is not to fit in. And when I think about it, I also don't want to fit in. I don't want to. There's a lot of things where I'm like, I don't want to fit in, but it also is difficult because then on the flip end of it, it's like, oh, you know, Julio dresses like this, it could maybe mean this, right? What I have felt a lot, especially now entering grad school, is this idea of stereotype threat. That's something that I do
Mhm.
something, or the way I dress is gonna be like, oh, it's this sort of like poor inner city kid, things like that. But I think on the flip end of it, I think the moments where I'm reminded why I should continue to be myself, irrespective of the potential consequences, is when other students have told me things like, I've never seen someone dress like that. Or, like it's so cool to see, someone that isn't sort of in the norm or, can, as I jokingly like to say, um, I enjoy and I enjoy sort of the time for the academic. It's fun, but there's also, as I like to say with friends, and I mean this in the most endearing way, I kind of like to be like a pendejo. Like I like to be like, you know, it's
Uh-huh.
like I also like to joke around and I like to take things like not seriously, and I like to listen to certain music. And this year at Berkeley, I've also like got into social dancing. I really like that. And all this other stuff where we try to create a balance. So then why the concept of this academic outsider, I think for me finally is one of the most important things. It's this idea of no matter what you do, you'll be an outsider. And so let's just say I fell to the pressures and I'm like, I'm going to dress like these people. I'm going to talk like these people. I'm going to try to be like these people. And I'll still be an outsider. I'll still be reminded that I'm different. So then I take the approach of might as well, knowing that that's going to happen regardless, I'll be myself. The other thing I think is that gave this, and this happened at Cornell. I realized, wow, I remember one class I was with the valedictorian of one of the best boarding schools in the country, Exeter, which is in Massachusetts. And I went to what people would call maybe one of the worst high schools in Queens, you know? And I remember that I was just like, wow, how did we like both end up in this class? You know, like, or just thinking, I just would always think like, how did I end up here? You know, how are these people here? How am I here? How am I here? And what gave me a lot of confidence is, and I say this also to students and when I meet with people that are similar boat or share some similar identities is I could come into these people world and play this game that they're playing, but they cannot come into the world that I was in and play the game that and with that, I was just like, we're not even the same. We're different, you know, and that for me at least has given me an edge where I'm like, yeah, like I could do this both. And as difficult as the journey has been, I also rather be on that end of knowing the things I know. And the one of the other things was, at least in my experience, and this is not, maybe like applicable across the board, but I had like such, as difficult as it was, like rich life experiences. And then I was seeing some of the, what you would maybe consider like the quote unquote normal people and I saw that a lot of times, like they didn't have certain life skills that I think were important, like they were so used to being well taken care of, like things like cleaning, like cooking, or like just navigating, I don't know, the street, as I would say. Um, and again, I had those things and I would see other first gens that are like had to work and navigate other stuff where I think that that is so important and those experiences need to be told because I think one of the weirdest things is, you know, of course, like people aspire to be at these places like Cornell, Berkeley, but that is such a small segment of the population. Like those experiences of being working class, of having to deal with immigration, of dealing with like low paying jobs or like a not a good labor market, that's so much more common. And you relate to other people's the normal person, you relate to them so much more. Um, and then I think one of the final things that help is really your community. I mean, most of my friends, and especially good friends, we're all on the same boat. We're all kind of first gen, like low socioeconomic status, uh, not white, deal with immigration, sort of similar ideals, similar sort of experiences that then I'm like, it's almost for me like it's armor. Like I go into these spaces and it's difficult sometimes to navigate academia or like predominantly white spaces, but then I come back sort of to these people to remind me like this is not normal. Like I just we just had a winter break and I went to New York City. And it was so good for me because I was just like around normal people that don't care about academics, that are not like hyper analyzing the way you are, the way you speak, how you should
Mhm.
present yourself. It's just people that want to go with their day. I don't know, care. We're trying to buy food for the holidays, to cook for their children, for their family members, for their friends. Um, so I think, and it's not to say, don't get me wrong. I mean, like, I definitely sometimes feel like, oh, insecure or, oh, did I say something that was considered not smart? And I don't think that ever goes away. Some people will say, and I agree, like the imposter syndrome or like doubting yourself. And I don't think it ever goes away. I don't, as much as my self worth has increased, uh, through other ways, also like therapy. I've been going to therapy since I was like 18. I'm 25 now. It's 7 years. It's a huge difference that I've worked through a lot of things. So I think, and so with that, I think, yeah. And then the other part that I sort of think about, the final part is like, and I've said it in this way, which is also maybe not the best way, but I think sometimes in these spaces, you almost have to be a sinvergüenza. But what I mean by that is you have to kind of not care. And my caveat to that is it's unfortunate that it always falls on individuals to fix things instead of realizing how academia as a structure is the one that's wrong and not individuals. There's nothing wrong with me. It's the way that the academy treats, the way the academy views me and other people, um, And so when I say this sinvergüenza or sort of not caring it, you have to sort of become used to awkward conversation because, as a, academia can be an awkward place. You have to get sort of comfortable with asking because if you don't ask, you'll never know. And a lot of times you'll be surprised what asking can do. I mean, there's been so many opportunities that have occurred just by asking. And of course, on the other side of it, there's also people will tell you no, or people may not meet with you, or people will be standoffish. I've also had a lot of those. But then I'm like, I think about either the positive experiences. I'm like, okay, they don't want to for whatever reason, like that's on them. Which and then also not caring is this idea of externalizing things, right? So you could you could either view like a lot of times I'll view academia as the problem and not me. And that doesn't mean like I don't hold myself accountable in instances, but trying to do that is what's helpful. And even as I say all of this, the downside is that it's always on the individual to do something. And there isn't, bigger policies, bigger forces trying to help that. There's probably some initiatives, don't get me wrong, but a lot of times it falls on the individual. If people are poor, a lot of times the government and the way it's framed is like something about them, something about this person, instead of thinking, how are we treating these neighborhoods? What are we like? How have we
Mhm.
disinvested? How do we view these spaces? What policies are we putting in place? What policies are we not? How are we causing harm? Um, so yeah, and I think the final thing is, which I sort of said this earlier, and maybe it helpful to people, is like there's always going to be someone else watching, and they may not tell you that, like, wow, insert any name, Julio, any other person, just seeing you, just interacting with you, or sharing resources, or hearing from you, helped me so much. I mean, I've had so many people that I've thanked, but also people that I've never met that just by observing them, by seeing the things they said, by reading their work, I was like, wow, this is so special, or like something I could be. Like this book, it's a very good reminder, like academic out there. Wow, like someone else is feeling something that's so similar and I could
Mhm.
resonate with that. And I think and I'm always, despite everything that's happened and everything that's going on in the world now, I still am an optimist and idealist. And so little by little things will get better. There's gonna be more, for example, Latino faculty, Black faculty, first gen faculty, and across the board, any profession. Um, and little by little, things will hopefully get better. And I think I just see myself as being, a part of just trying. Because if it's not, for me, it's like if I don't believe this, then what am I doing it for? So, like, I see myself as, I think I think I see myself as this bridge to trying to be better as an academic, as a person, as a man in this world. And that could be better for my siblings. It could be better for my grandma, better for my friends, better for my community, better for future students, colleagues, peers. And so even if, like a bridge could get worn out and you could get stepped on, right? Bridges get walked over and I could get stepped on and I could be harmed and things can happen and I could face sort of maybe stereotyping or this, but it's all for this sort of greater good of just, back to the intro, it sounds cliche, it's just trying to make the space better, the corners that I enter
Mhm.
better of this world. Um, and I think being driven by that, I'm always just reminded like there's this really good Kendrick Lamar lyric that says, I'm sacrificing myself for the healing. And I see myself that I resonate with. Even if again I experience negative things, it's somehow gonna make things better. Maybe also
Mhm.
for me. I mean, I've had such amazing, wonderful opportunities, been to so many places I could have never imagined. And, contributing and I love what I do. I feel so lucky. And I always say like this is unimaginable. Like it so very long-winded answer to try to get at the sort of imposter syndrome. But in short, it is very difficult. And I think sadly about on individuals a lot, but hopefully like some of those things resonate in the communal aspect. Like being in community, I think especially as I'm not like, as every year passes by, that becomes even more important, like just being surrounded by
Mhm.
people. So,
I feel like you already shared a lot of parting words, but, I'm curious if there's anything else you wanted to share or maybe some closing words of advice for first-gen BIPOC students who are still trying to decide between med school and grad school. Yeah, any final words?
ooh, that's good. A lot of pressure with that question. But let's see. I think one of the things is maybe that I think was helpful that I heard, and I don't feel like kind of commonly told. Think about the process of the route. So, right, med school is 4 years, 3+ years residency. Try to understand what that process looks like. I think try to understand what the PhD process looks like, and also think what are you gonna not only because I think about it as when I think of a career, I think of what is it that like, how can I realize the purpose of helping people, but also what do I enjoy, you know? Um, so I think when I think about the PhD process, as ambiguous as it can be, but I like it. I like that process of the reading, thinking, writing, and sort of the how I could take it my own direction. So I think try to understand the process and also think what would you enjoy more? And you could think about, I feel like it would be you could think about the financial aspect of it for sure. And, like I'm not really gonna make good money, you could say, until like after the PhD, which in 6 years I'd be 31, right? So in some ways it comes at a cost. Same thing with med, it comes at a cost of loan. And you can try to think, okay, like make the most sense with your situation as well. Everyone has a different situation. And so I don't want to say like, oh, you should do this because of this or that. So I think understanding the situation, how that could impact. Um, and I think the final thing, which is sort of how I live, but it's also risky because I don't have, I am my own safety net, you know, I'm also my family's safety net. Um, and so it's risky. And what it's risky because, you know, I'm still at a point where a small left turn could blow things up in a negative way. But I also have the mindset of like, this is only one life. And I try to think, what am I not going to regret? And what am I going to get the most joy out of doing? And, being like, it's made me proud in hindsight that I made such a big decision and such an important decision, a difficult one. And it turned out to be one of the best decisions I've ever made because I trusted myself, considering everything that had happened as well, right? And doing this like pros and cons list. So I think I also try to would say maybe like I think a lot about like, oh, when my time comes, when I'm like 80 years old, or like, what am I gonna be proud of? Um, and so I think it's a balancing act for sure, right? Balancing what are your passion and like how does that map out to the process of grad school? What are like the financial sort of obligations, especially again, like if you're first gen, if you're low income, if you're an immigrant family, if you're like the head of household and you have to support things. Think about that as well. And then I think the other part is also think about yourself. Oh, that's one final piece. A lot of times, especially when you're first, this is generalizing. If you're first gen or if you're more like you grow up or you're reared in a way that's very family heavy, for example, like I was, it can be very easy to not follow your own dreams or passion because you always have to think about that. And I think that's a good thing. I'm not saying don't think about, either your parents or your siblings or your friends. Definitely think about them. But also, I don't even like to say selfishly because I don't think it's selfish, but also prioritize yourself. And so even if, for me, and I had told this to my grandma, I want you to know I'm not going to make any good amount of money until I'm over 30. Because, and that's just the risk I'm taking. I could have gone another route and pursued sort of a career that out of college would have gave me 6 figures, but I knew I wouldn't be happy. And I knew so it's definitely a balancing act of, you know, your situation, the process, and sort of trying to reduce regrets, I think. Um, Yeah, but it is a difficult question to answer for sure.
Those are some wise words of advice for folks that want to connect with you.
Mhm.
What's the best way for them to reach you?
So LinkedIn for sure. And then my email, which is Julio Fernando Salas at Berkeley. I'm responsive on both, and I'm always happy to talk to people, especially now that like sort of, well, for the most part, PhD admissions are done. Slash, now they're trying to pick people. I've been meeting with a lot of people, and it brings me a lot of joy when I meet with other students that are interested, and then that's one of the things I always make time for, and even more than thinking, reading, and writing about research. So LinkedIn and my email are two places that would be great.
Great. I'll make sure to include that in the show notes as well. I want to thank you so much, Julio, for coming
Thank you.
today and sharing your amazing stories. At one point, I was like, I feel like I'm sitting here watching a movie and all the twists and turns. I was like,
Yeah, so many.
but I know that the listeners are going to get a lot from your insights and from your stories. So thank you so
Mm,
much for sharing your wisdom and knowledge
Thank you
today.
so
I
much.
appreciate you.
Thank you so much. That's the hope, and thank you for making the time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for joining me in the Grad School Femtoring podcast. If you like what you heard, here are 4 ways you can support the show. The first is to make sure you're subscribed and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. The second way is to get your copy of my free Grad School Femtoring resource kit, which includes essential information to prepare for and navigate grad school. You can access it at the link in today's show notes. The third way to support my show is to follow me on social media. You can find me on Instagram with the handle at Grad School Femtoring and on LinkedIn by searching my name. The last way to show your love is to sign up to work with me via my Grad School Femtoring Academy, my group coaching program for first-gen BIPOCs seeking to work on their personal growth and gain sustainable productivity skills. You can learn more at gradschoolfemtoring.com/academy. Thanks again for listening, and until next time,